So, what was your answer? Which types of people discount the future more? Now, of course, if we were in the classroom, this is a time where we would stop and have a discussion about this. And oftentimes, it's a little hard to wrap your head around this. So, I oftentimes will throw out some questions, right? Who discounts the future more? You could look at some things. So, the tendency might be, well, the young do. And I would argue the young don't necessarily have a higher discount rate. They just have a much longer time horizon. And so what we really need to do to make fair comparisons is we need to hold everything else constant and have the only thing that differs be impatience. So I don't know how many of you are either smokers or ex-smokers. Hopefully most of you, if not all of you, are not currently smokers. And I hope that many of you never picked up cigarettes. But I spent a long time, I spent about 20 years of my life as a nicotine addict. And so oftentimes one of the things people say in response to what types of people discount the future more is you could say, well, smokers do. I said, well, but the issue there, of course, is we're not holding constant addiction. So somebody who's never picked up a cigarette versus somebody who is a nicotine addict, the person who's a nicotine addict and smokes, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a higher discount rate. Now, however, we compare people from my high school class who I started smoking with when I was 18, maybe it was when I was 17. I may have broken the law there, but maybe I was certainly close to 18. If we took a look at those folks who I sat around with and smoked, some of us have quit smoking and others are still smoking, it would be reasonable to conclude that the people who are still smoking probably have a higher discount rate. That's not for sure, because maybe they just really enjoy the taste of tobacco. I really don't buy that argument too much. I think the main thing that people like in tobacco is the nicotine, but maybe that's the case. But so we would need to sort of hold things constant. So people who quit smoking probably discount the future less than people who are still smoking. We could also think about something else I do, which is ride motorcycles. And oftentimes people say, well, people who ride motorcycles, it's more dangerous, you're taking on more risk. That means that people who ride motorcycles discount the future more. And there's probably some truth in that. But I oftentimes will then argue, but we're not holding constant how much people enjoy riding around in the open air with that sense of exhilaration and freedom. Some people really enjoy it, and other people don't. And so it might be that the people who ride motorcycles do so because they get more benefit out of it, not because they discount the future more. However, but I think there's probably some truth. Some people who ride motorcycles definitely discount the future more. But a fair comparison, I would argue, is probably you could definitely see if we look at the motorcycle arena, not the physical arena, but I clearly haven't had enough sleep. I hope I won't ramble and wander off too far from the path here. But the point is that we could start to zoom in and say something about discount rates with motorcycle riders. Whenever I ride my motorcycle, even around town, and particularly around town, actually, I wear a helmet and protective gear. Now, I don't see it as much around here, but in Northern Virginia, where I was living before I moved out here, after I'd come back from Iraq, you'd see people in a singlet and shorts and flip-flops riding crotch rockets around town at high speeds. Now, they wore helmets because you were required by law in Virginia to wear a helmet, but they clearly were not engaging in any protective gear. And so I think it's fairly evident that those people discount the future more than people like myself who ride around in full protective gear, even in the middle of summer. Now, that's not definitive, but it's some context for starting to think about discount rates. You could also think about, and this is one way we can model criminal behavior. So oftentimes people look at criminals and they say, they're morons. They're stupid. How would they, right? I mean, they robbed a bank. The likelihood of getting away with robbing a bank is so low. And, right? And people rob convenience stores. You're not even going to get that much money. And so in some ways, we oftentimes look at criminality as a form of stupidity, but analytically, and I would argue that any model that is based on people being stupid is probably not a great model of the world. Rather, I would argue that one way of looking at criminality, again, we'd have to hold the circumstances the same. We'd have to have people in similar levels of poverty or similar levels of distress, some of whom engage in crime and others who do not. If we had that, the people who engage in crime, one way of modeling or thinking about their behavior or describing their behavior is that those are people with a higher discount rate. Now, I had a friend of mine who's from Germany who said, oh, wait, there are these kiosks on the street in Germany that sell beer. You can drink beer in public in many places, wander down the street. You don't have to have it in a paper bag. And so there's these places that sell beer, and it's really expensive. You can go like 2 blocks over to a convenience store or grocery store and get beer for a much lower price. Why do people do this? It seems like they're morons. Well, it might be that they're morons. It also might be that they're just drunk and they can't make their way to the grocery store. But another thing that you might think about is that might be an indicator that those people have a very high discount rate. So again, discount rates actually, I think, are a pretty useful tool in starting to think about humans and human behavior more generally, not just in the context of financial intermediation, but more generally in terms of society as a whole. So the third piece here is going to be marketing and psychology. It turns out that how a choice is framed has an impact. The book makes a big deal out of this. I don't really think this is all that important. Basically, a bunch of researchers have found that if savings is the default, in other words, if by default you are set up to save, and if you don't want to save, you have to go to your employer or the government and say, look, I don't want to save, and you have to fill out a form, etc. It turns out that if savings is the default, you have a higher rate of savings. And if savings is not the default, then you have to go to your employer or the government or somebody else and say, or your bank, and say, look, I want a certain portion of my paycheck set aside, etc., and you have to opt into savings. The savings rate is lower. Now, there's a big deal about this in the economics literature and the behavioral finance literature, and there's some anomalies that make this noteworthy. But as a general rule, I'd say none of this is surprising. If savings is not the default and I have to opt in other words, what happens? In comparing these two situations, in the bottom one, the cost of savings is higher. Now, it's not necessarily a lot higher, and that's where the behavioral economics literature has done its work, and there is some insight there. They said, look, the response is out of the magnitude we would expect. But for me, really what this is saying is, look, there's a benefit of savings. It's largely that smooth consumption. And there's a cost of savings I don't get to consume in the present. But there's also the cost that I have to spend my time, energy, and resources walking across campus or finding an investment advisor or filling out forms or all of this stuff. And so this seems to me to be a fairly straightforward case where if you decrease the cost of a behavior while holding the benefit constant, you get more of the behavior. So I'm not saying it isn't important. I'm not saying it's not relevant. But I would say that this is definitely not the piece that does the heavy lifting for establishing societal savings rates, particularly not fluctuations in savings rates in a given society across time. And the reason for that is you don't see radical fluctuations in the default of savings. Some situations, some societies, some economies have savings as the default. Others have savings as not the default. But if you're trying to understand short-term fluctuations in the supply of loanable funds, marketing and psychology is, generally speaking, except for some rare instances, almost irrelevant for that. And so the one that does and also, I would also mention that time preference also doesn't fluctuate very much. Really, generally speaking, some people are impatient and some people are patient. And so if we're trying to understand fluctuations in the supply of loanable funds in a given society, really the piece that has to do the heavy lifting is the consumption smoothing. If we're trying to compare savings rates between societies, then marketing and psychology and impatience and time preference come into their own. Now, interest rates are a price. They are a price that you are paid to save. And so I would argue these are not a determinant of the supply of loanable funds any more than price is the determinant of the supply of a good. In effect, we can, thinking big picture, if we increase the price, that will increase the quantity supplied. It will have no impact on the supply. And if we decrease price, then we're going to have a reduction in the quantity supplied. Hopefully you can rewind in your mind and remember that law of supply, that there is a positive relationship between the benefit to the suppliers and the quantity that they supply, and price being a major benefit. So interest rates tell us how much savers are paid to save. So if you increase the interest rate, and I'll make a note here, R stands for the real interest rate. I is going to stand for the nominal interest rate. You don't have to understand what that distinction means at all at this point. But just understand here what we're talking about is the real interest rate. That'll come in later on. So if you increase the interest rate, in other words, you pay savers more, they're going to send more of their savings across the bridge. And if you reduce the interest rate, then those savers are going to send less across the bridge. So really, interest rates aren't going to affect the pile on the left-hand side of the bridge. How big the pile of savings is going to be driven by consumption smoothing, impatience and time preference, and marketing and psychology. Interest rates are going to determine how much people are willing to send across the bridge, not necessarily the pile on the left-hand side of the bridge. Now, I'll start drawing some things later on when we get to this in terms of the example on the board. I like to think about about a pile of savings on the left-hand side of the bridge that is driven by the determinants of the supply of loanable funds, and then think about the decision to send those funds across the bridge, and that is going to be driven by a risk-adjusted interest rate. Bringing these together, as I already mentioned, we have the quantity on the horizontal, and we have the price on the vertical. Should be somewhat familiar to us. In other words, we have a schedule of all combinations of price and quantity. Now, this is holding constant all of the parameters in our consumption smoothing, and it's holding constant time preference and impatience, and it is holding constant marketing and psychology. This is a case where the only thing we are changing is the interest rate. And, just like before, it shouldn't be too surprising that our law of supply holds, because this is just another supply schedule, just like any other. The issue here, however, is that we are supplying is loanable funds, not specific goods. So you increase the price that people are paid to send their savings across the bridge, you get a higher quantity of savings that goes across the bridge. But again, the distinction between a change in supply and a change in the quantity supplied is as important here as it was early in the semester. Hopefully you're starting to understand. If you're not, this will be an explanation for why part of the reason why I insist that we go over supply and demand early on in the semester is to make sure that you're comfortable with it so that when we get into a new situation, we can use them. Now, you'll notice that the determinants of the supply of loanable funds are quite different than the determinants of supply in the goods market or in goods markets. And that shouldn't be too surprising because, again, nobody actually cares about these colored pieces of paper. They care about what these colored pieces of paper will get us. And so once we have our determinants, our supply function, once we have our supply function here, our supply function will act exactly the same way as our supply schedule generally will. You change some of the determinants. At all prices, you will get either more sent across the bridge or you will get less sent across the bridge. Now, there's another piece here. There's another blade of the scissors. This just tells us if the interest rate is this would be the quantity. If the interest rate is 10%, this is the quantity. Of course, what do we really want to know? We'd like to be able to say something not just about what the combinations of price and quantity supplied are, but maybe what we would expect the price to be. And just like in goods markets, in order to do that, we will need the other blade of the scissors. So I'll stop here and start a new video here in just a second. This is not the last video for the day.